a clash between road building crews and the Everglades, where these new developments are springing up like crazy, are clashing with the Florida topography. What happens there?
Yeah, that I would say is the important sub-theme of this whole book, Bubble in the Sun. It's really about how economic and environmental development and well-being really have to go hand in hand. I think we can see that writ large today, but even back then, the short-sightedness when it came to road building and things like that ultimately had big economic consequences when the environment kind of gave out. So, for example, I have a chapter about a third of the way through the book about the building of the Tamiami Trail, which was a road right straight through the middle of the Everglades, trying to link Tampa to Miami, which was going to be good, of course, for real estate development and would allow tourists to travel across the state. Of course, what they ended up doing by building this road was building a mammoth dike right through the state's great aquifer, the Everglades. And that was short-sighted, to put it mildly. Of course, it was disaster for the wildlife, but it would end up leading to the kind of water shortages that Florida has today. Now, I have in the book, as a kind of counterpart to the developers, the story of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who people may have heard of. She was the great environmentalist of this period, and lived to be 108. So she became the great defender of the Everglades. And even she, at the beginning, was kind of pro-roads and pro-this road and didn't understand what the consequences would be. She came around, and I have a couple of chapters devoted to her and sort of the making of an activist, if you will. And she participates to the extent she builds her own bungalow during this period, and she sees what's happening. She kind of gets religion about the importance of, environmental responsibility. It's not till 1947 that she writes her great book on the Everglades. And she'll live to be 108 and receive a Presidential Medal of Honor before she dies. All the other developers have been dead for 50 or 60 years, so there's some poetic justice to that.
One other aspect of the story before we get to the fall. I know that there were a lot of celebrities who lived down there. I think John Rockefeller, at the end of his life, has a Florida estate. Thomas Edison, I believe, has something down there after Menlo Park. Was this the first sort of celebrity enclave in the United States, sort of a precursor to Palm Springs that you're aware of?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a part and parcel of those. I think Hollywood had come into its own. You can almost see Florida and California competing with each other, economically and in terms of selling the sun, and in terms of attracting and exploiting the celebrities who are present during this era. But you certainly get everybody you can think of coming through Florida, whether it's the great boxers of the era, the great football teams. This is the period when professional sports, the 1920s, is when professional sports really take off for the first time. And, you've got Red Grange, playing in Coral Gables. But you've also got Babe Ruth, at a training camp in St. Petersburg. And, of course, the media mob him, and everybody is delighted to have Babe Ruth in Florida. You've got everybody you can think of, from musicians to, Gloria Swanson, who are coming down and staying at the great hotels, the great resorts. And, of course, they're encouraged to by the developers and probably comped for their drinks and the like. But it's a unique situation.
Hey, everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
How does the bust begin? Any type of land speculation like this, it obviously can't go on forever. How much of it is just a natural endpoint of economics when something like this happens versus what the realtors were doing themselves and other factors?
Well, I think you have to lay a lot of the blame for what ultimately happened on these developers because they just kept pushing, just kept expanding. They couldn't really stop themselves. I talk about how, this land boom, which is a nationwide land boom, with Florida as the sort of epicenter of it, is probably, I think, very likely what provided the dynamite and the detonator for what led us into the Great Recession. Now, recessions and depressions are very complicated, and there's probably no one single cause, but this is very likely one of the real triggers here, and I think its significance has really been overlooked. I mean, it wasn't the stock market crashing. It's rarely the stock market crashing that causes a recession, unless there's a real monetary disruption as a result. So it's these real estate bubbles coming to an end. They cause downturns that are twice as deep and last twice as long, and it always ends up affecting the common man who doesn't necessarily have his money in the stock market, but very likely has bought a piece of real estate along the way. So what really caused the turn? Well, I speculate on that. There are a number of things that, there is a great hurricane in 1926 that hit Miami Beach square in the face. And, an awful lot of the construction was shoddy, as you would expect in late in a frenzy like this. And people were unprepared for it. And devastation was really terrible. 2 years later, another hurricane hits up near Palm Beach and causes a lot of flooding up there, and a lot of African-American farm workers are drowned disastrously. Many bodies never recovered. It's hard to sort of pinpoint. I think basically I argue in the book that it just exhausted itself, that everybody who could buy real estate had done so and at inflated prices, and there just came a point where people were trading options on real estate instead of really investing in real estate. They were pure speculating in real estate. And normally that's when it all comes to a bad end.
How did this lead to the Depression? I'm surprised that a building boom in one particular state could have ripple effects throughout the entire U.S. economy. So how do you link those two together?
Well, as I say, this was such a big boom. And it was national in scope. Even though the real estate was located in Florida, people from all around the country had invested in Florida. There were places in banks in Massachusetts and Ohio that were getting concerned about the deposits that were being pulled out of the state and being invested in Florida, and the same in Georgia. But what really created the contagion, was it all came to such a sudden end, and all the lumber that was flowing into the state, it had actually gotten clogged up. The railroads had to create an embargo. There was so much building material trying to get into the state all at once, and in 1926 they had to put an embargo in place to try to sort it all out. And so all of that, all those building supplies, all that sort of came to an end all of a sudden, and banks started to fail, first in Florida, then in Georgia, and you have that kind of contagion that you always have when you have the, deflationary spiral take hold. So I don't think it's surprising that it triggered the rest of the country to start to pull back. I had an awful lot of people who'd lost an awful lot of money, a lot more than money in the Great Crash. So that's the thesis.
I have to ask about these developers. You mentioned earlier that one eats himself to death, one drinks himself to death, others come to other ends. Is it they simply lost a lot of money in this bust and that's what triggered it? Were they involved in illegal dealings or something else?
Well, a little bit of both. It depends on the developer. There was one who started out, George Merrick started out enormously idealistic and principled. And when he saw that how much money he was going to lose, he committed fraud. He started to unload his properties onto the city of Coral Gables, which he also ran or was, chairman of the county commission and the city commission. So he sold real estate in effect to himself at inflated prices, raised the bonds to pay for this real estate. Those bonds, of course, would default, wouldn't be paid off until 1961. He did everything he could to save himself, but it wasn't enough. He would lose everything. He'd have 2 nervous breakdowns as a result, became an alcoholic for a time. He managed to pull his life back together at the end, but never made anything back. And similar things happened with some of the others. It's a very cautionary tale. It's just hard to turn the spigot off. These guys were just started to believe their own publicity, which is what happened.
What would Florida look like in, let's say, 1930? After the bust happens, is it empty buildings, kind of like these cities that are built in China that have no inhabitants? Is it houses being sold at fire sale prices? What does it look like?
Yeah, well, I have some description in the book at the end, and it is something of a wasteland with you drive down the length of the state, you just see one after another of these resort developments with their abandoned golf courses and the pavement starting to grow over and the lampposts starting to lean, and it's really kind of an extraordinary sight, and it would be years before they could sort out the liens on these properties and who owned what. They're all tied up in litigation, and that's what was happening across the country, and another reason why the Depression lasted as long as it did. There was so much real estate out there that was, first of all, worthless, but second of all, tied up in legal problems. And a lot of it was in, the ideal location where you'd want perhaps to develop, but you couldn't. It looked like a real estate wasteland. I like your analogy, though, with China, because we've been waiting to see what's going to happen to all those phantom buildings on mainland China that we know are sitting empty and abandoned. And now with all this chaos in Hong Kong, which historically has had some of the highest priced real estate in the world, you wonder if Hong Kong won't be the dynamite and the detonator there and bring down not just Hong Kong real estate values, but mainland China as well. And now I gather there's just trillions of dollars of bad debt out there. So if you were to ask me what's going to be the next great real estate catastrophe, I don't think it'll necessarily be on American soil. It'll probably be on Chinese soil.
Yeah, I was curious about that. I definitely see parallels with what you described in Florida and 2008. Do you think most of that has been left and we're mostly past that and what will happen next is overseas? Or could something like this happen in the United States in the future based on what you're seeing?
Well, I think, let's face it, history does repeat, at least economically. We're sure to have other booms and busts in real estate. And at the end of my book, Bubble in the Sun, I talk about some of the uncanny similarities between what was happening in Florida in the 1920s and what we see out there today in this country. So, for example, you look at the United States, you see 2 affluent coasts separated by this sort of impoverished and agricultural interior. Well, that was Florida in the 1920s. You see inequitable wealth distribution talked about a lot in the press. Well, that was true in the 1920s. In the 1920s, you had rising xenophobia and racial intolerance. You had, of course, the KKK was the great example of that. You had this dangerous over-reliance on laissez-faire economics. That is true today, it can be argued. Then you had a governance structure, in Tallahassee in the 20s, where the bankers and the business people had incredible influence over domestic policy. That wasn't a good thing. And then, to kind of complete the analogy, you had leadership there in Tallahassee, as I think we would agree we have today, that was just indifferent to the fate of the environment and to societies less fortunate. So an uncanny number of parallels with what we see out there today. And I remind the reader in the book that, it didn't end well in the 20s. And I think there's a genuine risk of history repeating. It's especially with the stock market now as elevated as it is. Maybe real estate's not there yet, but the stock market's looking very pricey.
One other question to tie this together, and it has to do with the legacies of this bubble bursting. There's one thing I have in